I can't imagine a world without iron. No ships, no cars, no trains, no tools, no iron at all. We'd be back in the Stone Age. We're sitting on a ball of rock with a center of solid iron, 360 miles across. This solid iron core creates a magnetic field around the Earth that protects us from cosmic rays. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. The ancients call this the metal of heaven, iron. Iron is the first metal that enabled us to make really good tools. It transformed civilization.
Today, Northwest Connecticut is rural country, dotted with farms and small towns. For generations, this was the center for iron making in America. To see any evidence of it now, you have to know where to look.
My mom was born in Tralee, County Kerry, Ireland, and came over in 1914. She married my dad in 1926. My dad and I worked together a lot. I grew up with him. I played baseball with him. He was a baseball player, so I followed along fairly naturally. One of the things I remember very well as a kid was that I was always taught to be very careful in the woods where I spent a lot of time because of the rattlesnakes in the area. One day after school, my dad took me to the Richmond Furnace, which had been closed at that time. This was 1932. I was 5 years old, but it really impressed me. I was very short, and the furnace was 32 feet high. I think that really started me, giving me a lot of interest in the furnace. So I spent a lot of time in the woods, finding streams, finding old dams, finding foundations, and then going back and trying to recreate what went on in those places. And I finally found the location of all 44 furnaces that once operated in the Upper Housatonic watershed.
Early settlers found a wilderness with a few Indian trails and villages. When rich iron deposits were discovered in the early 1700s, mines were opened and forges were built. New settlements sprang up near them.
Northwestern Connecticut was ideal for iron making. It had high-quality iron ore, it had wood for charcoal, it had water for power, it had lime for a flux in the furnace, and it had the kind of people who can make all of this work.
Most of the early iron workers came from England and settled in eastern Massachusetts. The discovery of quality iron ore at Old Hill, now called Ore Hill in Salisbury, brought men and their families to the northwest corner of Connecticut. These were tough, resilient people who understood the value of hard work. They were smart, they had discipline, and they knew the business. The growing country needed iron, and these were the people who could supply it. Bloomery forges were used to make small amounts of wrought iron.
If you're talking about the operation of a Bloomery Forge, you're really talking about something like this. Bloomery Forge is stone-built, stands about 8 foot high. It has a jet of air coming in from a little bellows to speed up the burning of the charcoal. Iron ore is placed into it and heated up to a temperature somewhere around 13 to 1500 degrees. And then it's pulled out with tongs when it's pulpy, put on an anvil, and pounded by a giant helve hammer. It weighs 500 to 600 pounds. It's water powered, and that helps to drive out the slag. Then it's put back in the forge again, We go through the same process 3, 4, 5 times until we finally have wrought iron that is suitable for working.
All early industry depended on harnessing the power of river water. Increased demand for iron required innovation. Water wheels, the height of a 2-story house, provided the power to send a continuous blast of air into fiery chambers, hot enough to create molten iron. The blast furnace. The heart of the operation is a massive stone furnace standing over 30 feet high. Materials are loaded into the top of the furnace. They drop into the furnace shaft, a holding chamber lined with fire brick. As charcoal, lime, and iron ore are added through the top of the furnace, a steady blast of air from the blowing tubs is forced through pipes into the hearth at the bottom of the furnace. A 3,000-degree fire is created, and molten iron collects in the crucible at the bottom of the hearth.
The hearth is tapped, the molten iron begins to flow out. Tremendous amount of heat, and it's as bright as the sun.
The metal cools and hardens in sand troughs and is called pig iron.
The operation of a blast furnace is 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, as much of the year as you can have it running. Beckley is a good example of a successful furnace.
It was located in East Canaan, Connecticut, 11 miles from the best iron deposits near Salisbury. The high-quality iron produced here was called Salisbury iron. The Beckley Furnace had a railroad spur to bring in ore, lime, and charcoal, and to take out finished iron. It was highly productive and could make as much as 25 tons of pig iron a day. Further south, the Roxbury furnace used a different kind of ore.
I don't think they were any bad furnaces. I think the problems usually came from something associated with the furnaces, as in the case of the Roxbury furnace, which was very well built. The problem really was with the type of ore that they tried to use, and that was the only ore in that area. The iron workers that worked in these things, I have a great deal of admiration for them. I mean, they were artisans in many ways, and very hard workers under very dangerous conditions. My great-grandfather was John Lawton, who worked as a miner at the Richmond Furnace in Richmond, Massachusetts. He came over from Ireland in 1856 after the potato famine and became an excellent miner and an excellent workman at the furnace later on. Early miners worked pretty much in open pits. Later, the open pit mining gave way to underground mining, tunnels, and so forth. It was tough work. You were working underground. You had to work with timbering to hold up the mine shafts. The temperatures in there, once you got down a little way, were about 55 degrees all the time. The Irish that came over were basically unskilled, so they got the grunt work. They worked with pick and shovel 10 or 12 hours a day. And when they came home, they were pretty well beat. And the next day, they had to do it all over again. Woodcutters begin their work in late October and usually cut until about April. They cut their wood in 4-foot lengths and had it all stacked and ready for the colliers.
The colliers were the charcoal makers. They cooked wood into the pure and hot-burning carbon fuel needed for iron making. The process took weeks.
First job is to stack the wood, and then you cover the stack with mud and leaves. And then you light it underneath and control the draft so you just allow it to smolder. You want to drive out the other materials and keep the carbon in. I watch the color of the smoke, which indicates to me if it's burning too much or if it's smoldering too much. You're watching this while you're building the next one. Usually you'll have any place from 3 to 5 of these in a row, and you build the next one and start that one. You build the next one and start that one. Day and night, I'm watching the smoke on one pile, controlling the draft, moving to the next pile and building it up, starting that pile, building the next one. That goes on and on and on. Takes about 14 days for each pile. One of the worst things that can happen for us in the field is that if the charcoal pile catches fire, then it burns up everything. We have no charcoal left. We have nothing but ashes.
The outer shell of the pile appears stable, but just inches below the surface lies a 1600-degree oven.
As the charcoal smolders and we drive out some of the things that we don't want, the pile gets a little bit smaller, but it also gets a little bit looser on occasion. And what happens is that we send one of our men up and he jumps up and down on the pile to make sure it's packed well. Occasionally, he goes through. There'll be an opening in that job. Colliers are never clean. It was impossible to be clean in their line of work. They came home with charcoal in their skin, charcoal in their clothes, and charcoal in their lungs.
Making charcoal was tedious, dirty, and solitary work. After the charcoal cools, the teamsters haul wagon loads from the forest to the furnaces in the valley. This was a part-time job usually done by local farmers.
Furnace workers were a bit more elite. They were specialists. They knew their jobs well, or they didn't hold the jobs for very long. Top filler's job is to push a handcart across the bridge that goes to the top of the furnace and dump in his load of material. Well, you have about 30 seconds, and there's going to be 3 of you doing this. The blast is shut off for that period of time. The fillers fill the furnace from the top through the tunnel head. The material gradually settles down. It's burning with the charcoal all the way down as it goes through. When it gets down near the Bosch area, which is the whitest part, the temperature is up near 3,000 degrees. At this point, the iron turns into molten iron as a liquid, runs down the walls into the hearth, and settles in the crucible, which is the bottom part of the hearth. One of the places I don't want to be is in the casting shed. It's summer. It's 140 to 150 degrees in the casting house. Your buddy throws a bucket of water on you to get you ready for the casting. Some of these furnaces actually closed down because it was too hot in July and August. The operation really comes down to the ironmaster. He's responsible for what goes in and what comes out. He has very good people working for him, but the buck stops with him. There are many things that the ironmaster has to be aware of. Does he have the right mix of iron ores? Is the charcoal as dry as it should be? Is the lime in there for the right amount? There are so many things that can go wrong. It's keeping all those things right that gets the kind of iron that he's looking for.
Here is Fred Perdizet, one of the last great iron masters. He is responsible for the Beckley Furnace and Furnace number 3 in East Canaan. The Iron Master dreaded a knock on the window in the middle of the night, warning him of a problem at one of the furnaces.
When you get something in a furnace that's called a clinker, it's the result of a mass of the material inside all sticking together. And at that point, we need to open up the tunnel head and get people up there with giant pokers that would punch them down through the clinker in order to break it up. There are a number of serious things that could happen. One of the workers that worked at the top of the furnace, working with pokers to break up the materials down below, could fall in.
A salamander is a large body of hardened iron, slag, fire brick, and stone that can form at the bottom of a furnace.
A salamander is big trouble, but it's not an uncommon occurrence. Most furnaces will experience a salamander every 5 to 6 years. If you get any water on molten iron at all, you get steam explosions, and that could blow up the whole casting shed and part of the furnace.
Pig iron was reheated and cast into useful items by the molders. Wooden molds were pressed into casting sand, creating perfect replicas to be filled with molten iron. Molders were paid only for flawless castings. They were intensely proud of their craft. Making iron was big business. The men who built the furnaces built the towns.
Thomas Lamb, a wily entrepreneur. Iron was discovered here in 1731. He was here a year later, buying up land, water rights, and was the first person to start an iron business. Thomas Lamb was a rascal. He used ore from a bed that he didn't own. He was later sued for that, and the local people collected. Hiram Weed ran an iron furnace in Sharon. A very religious man, so he closed his furnace on Sunday, which you just don't do. And he got to start again on Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday, but he still was quite successful. The Barnum Richardson Company was started by Milo Barnum around 1830 in Lime Rock, Connecticut. He teamed up with Leonard Richardson, who was his son-in-law, and they developed the company and produced pig iron in the village of Lime Rock. William H. Barnum became president of the Barnum and Richardson Company in the 1850s, one of the most powerful men, both nationally and internationally, as the United States Senator, a great marketer, and also got President Cleveland elected. William H. Barnum started buying additional furnaces and made this into a larger company, probably one of the largest in the world, from the period of 1870 to 1890. Salisbury Iron was the Rolls-Royce of iron. It was malleable and it could withstand a tremendous amount of shock, which would make it very good for anchors and cannon and muskets, and particularly for railroad car wheels. They did a test in England. They laid one of the railroad car wheels out flat, and they got two husky guys with huge sledgehammers and began beating on the sides of the wheel. And they hit it again and again and again, 100 times, 200 times, 300 times. And no cracks in the wheel. And it wasn't until the 367th blow was struck that the wheel actually began to crack. And it took several more after that before they could break through it. Included in their marking were such things as saying that when you ride on a train, you don't hear the car wheel saying clickety-clack, clickety-clack. They're saying Barnum and Richardson, Barnum and Richardson, Barnum and Richardson. By 1872, when Barnum and Richardson owned 8 furnaces and had foundries in Lime Rock, Chicago, and West Virginia, that was the biggest period of operation.
By 1830, the population of the 7 northwest corner towns exceeded that of the city of Hartford. Over 12,000 people lived and worked in the thriving villages of Lime Rock, Salisbury, and Lakeville. There were 24 furnaces and foundries operating in 3 shifts. Hotels, churches, schools, and taverns. Company houses for the workers and mansions for the owners.
The workers got together and decided to build a casino for social events and musicals, dances, that sort of thing. They couldn't come up with money enough, so Barnum Richardson gave them the extra money that they needed in order to finish it, and then made it 51% owned by the workers and 49% owned by Barnum and Richardson. So it really became a place for the workers, owned by the workers. Family was very important in the iron industry, and while the men were working with the iron or in the mining, the women were taking care of most of the chores that normally went with running a small farm and surviving. After school, the boys would come back to the furnace area and go over to the slag piles and pick through the new slag that was there, pick out any pieces of iron, and bring them back to the tenders at the furnace, and they'd get a few cents a day for doing that. Some of the kids that worked in the iron business were gophers, and they helped to bring in the tools that were needed. They were sent out when extra water was needed. They mainly carried things that weren't too heavy, but they worked, and they were often there 10 hours a day.
Working deep in the woods, away from the villages, the colliers welcomed visits from their kin. Sometimes whole families moved into the forest to be near the men who could not leave the smoldering charcoal piles. For those who worked long, lonely stretches in the wilderness, these visits were a happy time. Many families stayed in town to be near the church, school, and the company store. Furnace workers were usually paid in scrip, a credit voucher. The company store was run for the workers' families. It supplied most of what they needed.
The company store did a lot of good for the people, and it was vital to many of the people because it carried them in times when they may not have been working or they may have been sick. At the company store, when you were paid in scrip at the furnace, you could take your scrip and you would get 100% on the dollar. But if you went to one of the other stores in town or in another town, you'd get 90 cents or 95 cents on the dollar. These people worked hard, but they also played hard. They had music, they had drinking, and they had dancing. Woodcutters were a pretty close lot. They'd get together for a axe sharpening party at the end of the season, and they would drink grappa for a couple of days while they sharpened their axes. Grappa was a wine that was sort of made from the pumice that they scraped off of the winemaking vats, and they'd have an axe sharpening party that would probably last for a couple of days because they were through until October before they had to start that again.
By 1850, the iron industry was in full swing, with 30 furnaces operating in the Salisbury Iron District. The towns were bustling, and smoke filled the valleys.
The villages that were around the iron furnaces were not very clean. The water was polluted, and the air was certainly polluted, often from the charcoal fires. And when the sheets were hung out to dry on the line, they seldom came in clean by noon.
Business was booming with the help of war contracts that specified iron for cannon, guns, and ships. Horatio Ames, a 6.5-foot, 300-pound Iron Man, made a cannon that shot a 120-pound ball over 6 miles.
You've got the American Revolution, you have the Civil War, and you have World War I. War was good for the iron industry.
After World War I, things began to change. Open pit mining and new furnace designs were developing, but not in the Salisbury Iron District. The ever-increasing price of charcoal dealt the final blow to iron making in the northwest corner.
The death of the iron industry in northwestern Connecticut had a great deal to do with the failure to innovate. They just never kept up with the technology that was needed in the new iron age. During the Depression, people needed wood. They needed firewood. So they went out and tore down the buildings that were around the furnaces. And during World War II, a lot of the iron was melted down for the war effort.
The production of Salisbury iron declined drastically. A 200-year-old industry was dying. By 1923, the last furnace shut down.
So now all that's left are these stone monuments of an industry that deserves to be remembered.
To preserve our iron history, Ed Kirby and his colleagues take students and visitors on tours.
One of the areas that we take students in is the Beckley Furnace up in East Canaan, Connecticut, which has been all restored. When they get inside of that, you can look up, and we've got a plexiglass top on the furnace. So they can look up actually and see the clouds moving by. One thing they really like to do is, I say, okay, let's see how many we can get in there all together, and then they pack it up with kids on the inside of the hearth. So I tell them then, you're in the hearth, which is now 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit.
Will the next generation remember the furnaces and the people who made iron here?
I belong here. I'll walk these woods as long as I can. There's still things to find, streams to walk. I hope to be walking them a long time. This is important. This is our history. These are the people that made America.